So welcome everyone. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement that was written by Alex McKay for the Jackman Humanities Institute and adapted for this lunch. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the Digital Humanities Network operates, the lands on which all participants in the United States and Canada live and work, and the land hosting the servers and cables connecting us all in this virtual hybrid space. Indigenous people have shaped its history over thousands of years. On this land, they have developed distinct cultures, languages, economies, and ways of life. Here in Toronto, this land upon which we are assembled remains a sacred gathering space for many peoples of Turtle Island. We want to show respect for this by acknowledging that we are on the land of several Indigenous nations, paying special recognition to the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So the structure for this special edition hybrid lightning lunch will be basically the same as all of our digital lightning lunches. We have 4 presenters today who will each speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I'm going to introduce everyone at the start, and then we'll hold questions until the end. And folks joining us in person as well as on Zoom are warmly welcome to join the discussion. We will be recording and taking screenshots during the event. So if you don't want to be recorded, please just feel welcome to keep your camera off. And if you're in person and don't want to be recorded, too bad, you already are. But if you're in the audience, just give a signal to me and I'll make sure not to include you in our photos. And as always, audience participation is warmly welcomed. So please feel free to join in the chat, join us on Twitter. The hand raise function will be available for attendees to pose questions. For those of you here in person, please feel free to raise your physical hands. And when it's your turn, I'll ask you to unmute your mic and you can pose your question. If you'd prefer to put the question in the chat, go ahead and someone from CDHI will read your question aloud for the panel. Finally, this is a lunch, so feel free to eat your lunch. We know you're on your lunch break, and this is meant to be a more informal gathering and an interesting conversation between us all. So now I am going to dramatically pause while Matt starts the recording.
We are recording.
Okay. Welcome to CDHI's 5th Lightning Lunch of 2022-2023 on the exciting to me topic of building DH Labs and Makerspaces. So we're going to discuss the possibilities and challenges of creating diverse digital humanities spaces for research and scholarship. My name is Danielle Taschereau-Mamers, and I'm the Managing Director of the Critical Digital Humanities Initiative here at the University of Toronto. I'll be facilitating this in-person and virtual discussion today. And we are very welcome to be joined by 4 incredible scholars. I'm going to introduce all of them, and then we'll pass the mic to our first speaker. So today we have Bharath Venkat, Jessica Lockhart, Zoe Bull, and Con Vo. Dr. Bharath Venkat is the assistant professor at UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics, with joint appointments in the Department of History and affiliations at the UCLA Center for India and South Asia, the Program in Digital Humanities, and the Urban Humanities Initiative. His research focuses broadly on questions related to science and medicine, ethics, race, environment, and design. His first book, At the Limits of Cure, which came out with Duke in 2021, is an anthropological history of tuberculosis treatment in India and is the winner of the Joseph W. Elder Prize in the Indian Social Sciences. Bharath's current project, A History of Heat in Hot Places, seeks to study the experience of thermal inequality in contemporary India and the United States by drawing on archival, ethnographic, and oral historical materials, as well as climatological and cartographic data. For today's panel, Bharath will speak about the UCLA Heat Lab, which is an interdisciplinary effort to study the experience of thermal inequality, for which he serves as director. Our lovely CDHI assistants are going to drop, or maybe have already dropped, some links to Bharath's projects in the chat. And for those of you who are here in person, we'll include all of the links in a follow-up email. Our second speaker will be Dr. Jessica Lockhart, who is the head of research for the Old Books New Science Lab, or OBNS, at the University of Toronto, which is the topic of our talk today. Since 2014, OBNS has been a medieval studies graduate research community space, as well as a hub for the development of large-scale research projects and international cross-disciplinary collaborations concerning pre-modern book technologies. Lockhart has authored and co-authored articles in the Chaucer Review, Digital Humanities Quarterly, Digital Philology, and the volume Cultural Translations in Medieval Romance. And she is currently co-editing with Michelle Brown a special issue of Ancient Narrative alongside other publications emerging from the group's research. Jessica's current project, titled Hidden Stories, New Approaches to the Local and Global History of the Book, is a project that maps connections between parts of the pre-modern world by describing the technology of the book. And this project contains an amazing 130 collaborators working across more than 60 institutions around the world and is funded by the Mellon Foundation. Our third speaker is with me here in person, Dr. Zoe Wool, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Anthropology and the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Her work spans anthropology, disability studies, queer theory, and feminist social science and technology studies, with a focus on the materialities of post 9/11 war making and military harm, as well as the tyrannies of normativity in the contemporary United States. Her first book, titled After War, The Weight of Life at Walter Reed, which came out with Duke in 2015, was awarded honorable mention for the 2016 Gregory Bateson Book Prize, which is awarded by the Society for Cultural Anthropology. In 2018, Dr. Wool was awarded the prestigious Career Award from the National Science Foundation. She's the co-founder of Project Pleasantville, a team project documenting Black civic engagement and toxic exposure in Houston's Pleasantville neighborhoods. In 2021, Zoe launched the amazing Toxicity, Waste, and Infrastructure Group, or TWIG, Research Kitchen at UTM, which is a convivial and experimental feminist research space, and the topic of her talk with us today. And last, but certainly not least, is our incredible 2022-2023 JHI CDHI Digital Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow, Dr. Convo, who I am excited to share is also the incoming Digital Humanities Specialist at Brown University. Yes, applause, special applause for Con. Her research and current book project examines how the labor of marginalized groups can be understood through discourses of robotics, race, gender, and design, and more broadly, how discourses on robotics within the humanities and social science, within humanities and within science and technology communities have diverged. Her current DH project is on scaling digital history and documenting self-emancipation, which is forthcoming in an edited volume titled Zoomland, Exploring Scale in Digital Humanities, Digital History and Humanities, and that is coming out this spring. So we're very excited to share that soon. For today's panel, Con is going to share her experiences working with the Equality Lab at William and Mary University, which is a collaborative research space for answering fundamental questions about the nature of equality across many different domains, of which she is a founding member and was a graduate assistant. So without further ado, I am going to step away and pass the mic to Bharath to get us started.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's just great to be with all these folks. For some reason, my face is huge right now. And it's all I can see. So let me see if I can remove the spotlight and see everybody else. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay. Let me just see if I can get my slides working. Well, I'll just start talking and hopefully they'll eventually make themselves appear. Let me just begin by saying, so in January of 2020, I started this group at UCLA called UCLA Heat Lab. And I'd like to say that it came out of an urge for collaborative scholarly inquiry. And I think that's true, but I think the deeper, truer reason is it came out of a need to combat intellectual loneliness, right? So, you know, so many of us were surrounded by amazing colleagues, amazing students, but with our students, they come and go over the course of a quarter or a semester. With our colleagues, everyone's working on their own projects, right? And so there are moments of conversation, but nobody's going deep cuts with you on the thing that you're working on. And I wanted someone to go deep cuts with, right? I wanted someone to be able to talk about the nitty gritty, the kind of archival residues, the kinds of interviews, oral history, so on and so forth. And so I decided to start working with some undergraduates, not just for a quarter, but over the course of multiple quarters. And I began this group in January with, I think, about 6 students. And now we're up to 17, many of whom I've been working with over the course of multiple years, some through the entire kind of duration of their undergraduate experience at UCLA. And the students in the lab pursue all manner of project tied to the question of heat and thermal inequality. One of the things that I've done, which is I think been really helpful for me and for the students is to kind of take the foot off the pedal, and not to create expectations around things like publications or even finishing things. It's very much a space where people can try out things and decide if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and drop it. So there's not a kind of commitment from the beginning that you're going to develop a huge project and stay with it forever. And this allows students to take risks, to try out new things, and to kind of respond to what's happening around them. If I could show you my slides, I would talk about one specific project, which is, nope, still not working. That's all right. So there's so let me try one more time. There we go. Can you all see this now?
Yes.
I can no longer see you, but I'm going to assume that, okay, great. So this is the kind of neat little logo for the UCLA Heat Lab, and a bit of a description, but I want to move on to the food truck audit. So in the midst of the pandemic, many of the dining halls here at UCLA were closed down, and students started to rely heavily on food trucks for their lunches, for their dinners. And the students came to me and they said, we're really curious about thermal conditions, the kind of occupational environment within these food trucks. And so they developed this project that involved the use of sensors at various places within the truck. You can see in this image, they focus in the cooking area, the prep area, and the window. And they wanted to see what the temperatures were like inside of the truck. So they were able to collect data showing that, there are moments when the truck goes above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for multiple hours at a time. And you often only have maybe one or two people working in this space. So it's really hard to take breaks, right? And they coupled this data about kind of thermal experience with oral histories and semi-structured interviews. Let me see if I have a bit about that. Yeah, I don't think so. So they wanted to understand both kind of what was happening in the environment, but also how people were responding to it. And they learned a lot of really interesting things about, for example, the fact that there are kind of deeply racialized hiring practices, because there's an idea that Black, Latinx, Asian American workers are able to withstand the heat in a way that white workers can't. And they were told, for example, that white workers faint on the first day. So this kind of racialized idea about vulnerability and susceptibility and capacity to withstand heat, one that can be traced back to the colonial era, to the era of slavery, remains kind of strong and kind of reformulated for the contemporary moment in something like food trucks, but also in many other industries. And this project, and the other kind of interesting is that students began to look at the design elements of the food truck and regulation about what's allowed, what isn't. So, for example, the back doors have to be kept closed because of food safety issues, but this means there's less air circulation and it gets much hotter inside of these trucks. And I'll stop sharing this for a moment. If I can figure this out. Sorry, there you go. So the reason why I wanted to share this, because it's a project that emerges entirely from the insights and curiosities of the students in the lab. And I see my role as providing them with the tools to pursue these questions, right? So what does it mean in terms of methodology and learning about how to use sensors, how to do oral histories, what kinds of literature might you refer to, how might you go about doing an oral history in the first place, how much you refine your questions. So really, I see my role as facilitating their own inquiry, and in the process, I'm learning a lot from it. But again, I think what's really key here is that our commitment is to curiosity, our commitment is to developing a kind of robust ethics, but it's not necessarily to publishing and to producing a final product that can kind of be accredited in the kind of traditional currency of the university. Maybe I should stop there because I don't know how long I've been talking, and let the next person jump in.
Sure. Yeah, we'll move on to Jessica.
All right. Rod, that was fascinating. I just want to say that right off the top. There were so many things that you said that really resonated with my own experience, and I'm really excited for this conversation. Can you folks see the screen okay? All right, great. Yeah, thank you very much for hosting me. And I just wanted to add that although I'm based at U of T, I'm honored to be calling you folks today virtually from Calgary, Alberta, which is the traditional territories of the Treaty Number 7 nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So I'm here to talk to you about my experience as head of research of the Old Books New Science Lab at the U of T. As today's lightning lunch is about ways to foster space for DH scholarship and research, I'm hoping that you'll get 3 things out of the example of our lab. One is how large grant projects have related to our lab community. Like how does funding structures and community sit alongside one another? How the different members of our lab come together in physical and virtual space, and what role the lab space plays in our research and our lives. In preparation for this session, some of our lab members filled out an informal questionnaire. Thank you, lab members. And I'll occasionally be pointing to their responses in addition to drawing on my own experience. But first, a brief history of the lab. It was founded in 2014 by 3 medieval studies researchers, a faculty member, Alex Gillespie, a postdoc, Alexander Balantinianu, and a PhD, Laura Mitchell. They began hosting Friday meetings at the Jackman Humanities building, room 222. This is our room as of a few weeks ago. The name Old Books, New Science Lab comes from a quote by the Middle English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who says that just as year after year, old fields will generate new crops, old books continually generate new science, that is, new knowledge. Every time a new person reads a book, new knowledge is created. We call our group a lab partly as a nod to the science model, where a lab is the experiment space for a faculty member and their graduate students. Ours is a shared experiment space for humanities research. From the beginning, the lab had 2 parallel functions. We'll go to this slide. Nope. It created ways for Alex, the faculty member who founded it, to see her graduate student supervisees on a regular basis. And it was also an incubator for a new collaboration with the U of T Library's Information Technology Services team. This collaboration resulted in a successful grant application to the Mellon Foundation for a project creating digital tools for manuscript study. You can see their website here. And I can throw a link to it into the chat. It's really wonderful. So that grant provided funding and opportunities for students to gain experience as research assistants. And we also received training by attending the planning meetings of the grant project. So this is where I personally developed an interest in research project management. And from 2019 onwards, I became first the lab manager, then a project manager, and eventually head of research for the lab's next Mellon grants, which included the book In the Silk Roads and now Hidden Stories, New Approaches to the Local and Global History of the Book. So now the lab has grown. On a weekly basis, we have 40 odd active members on our virtual workspace, which is the Old Books New Science Slack. Here's a screenshot from it. It has channels devoted to international collaborations, individual research projects, event planning, and over a dozen research fields, as well as spaces for professionalization questions, community events, co-working, and social discussion. You can see in the screen cap that the Daily Cat has updated. That is, in fact, our most popular channel. There is a small core in our group of full-time researchers, librarians, and administrators who are employed full-time by our current grant, as well as a much larger community of undergraduate, graduate students, research assistants, developers, postdocs, faculty, and other overarching friends of the lab. From our initial collaboration of digital approaches to medieval European manuscript studies, our latest project, Hidden Stories, now includes global specialists in the physical and digital preservation of cultural heritage, in data sovereignty and relationship building with communities of origin, and also scientific fields ranging from collagen biochemistry to AI to micro-CT and structural engineering. This explosion in the interdisciplinarity of our research, as well as the move to a largely virtual community through the pandemic, has put some pressures on our group. Many of the people now in the lab have never met in person and may have very little knowledge of each other's fields. So I was curious as to what extent the original identity of the lab remains as I experienced it in 2014 as a grad student. And I'm interested in, is the lab still serving its original purpose of providing training for graduate students? I asked some of the lab members to fill out a questionnaire, and the respondents ranged from a new faculty member who has joined the team within the past few months, to our lab manager currently, to a PhD candidate who's been here several years, and to one of our lab founders. So what is the lab now? I asked lab members what it was, And these are a couple of the responses. A community researching manuscript studies, book history, medieval literature. Researchers brought together by Alex's grant dollars, Alex's grad students, and new sourced friends and collaborators. The lab is a double metaphor, both a group of people, lab is community, a virtual manifestation of people who research, learn together, and a virtual space. The lab is a room, a virtual manifestation of a co-working space. What stands out to me first is that Sebastian Sebecki's response is almost identical to how I understood the lab at the beginning. It seems that the lab's early identity as a community gathered around Alex's grad students, assorted friends, grant money, that dual identity has been retained and it's recognizable to at least some new lab members. Furthermore, the responses show that the lab continues to be a place that graduate students and other researchers come to for professionalization, support, and inspiration as they conduct their research. Here's a little snapshot of some of the other responses. So what do people get from the lab? A connection with the academic realm, co-working, the accountability channel, a sense of community, a concentration of wonderful people with shared though not identical interests. Shaped my idea of what a supportive and progressive medieval studies community could look like. So the lab is still providing some of these core functions, and it is still very much an experiment space, I think, along the lines of what Dr. Pratt was just describing. There is a desire for more connection between what one respondent calls the graduate student and research arms of the lab, as well as a desire for connection in general, as represented by the wish for more in-person meetings and the appreciation of our accountability channel, which is a place where lab members co-work virtually in real time and seek support in accomplishing their goals. There's lots more that I could say about how we've been working to nest our current brand project and its work inside the lab, for instance, with our system of public and private Slack channels. But overall, my takeaway from the Old Books, New Science Lab success is that orienting it to serve the needs of the community back in 2014 and onwards has made it self-sustaining in ways that don't rely on a funding structure. Instead, I keep going back to our lab name and the new grain from the old fields that Chaucer mentioned. By maintaining the lab's function as a welcoming workspace first and foremost, the lab has continued to attract, incubate, and generate new researchers, new projects, and new ideas. So that's an introduction to the Old Books, New Science Lab. On to our next speaker. Thank you.
You'll have to go back to the Zoom. Basic. At the top, basic.
Basic, okay. Get me out of the advanced screen. We're getting there. We go. Okay. Yeah, this is I echo Jessica's thoughts there that there's a lot of resonance. And I think this question about like how to go deep cuts with someone, as Barath was just saying, is definitely part of the inspiration behind the emergence of the kitchen. So I'm gonna kind of click through some slides, and I have a timer for myself to try and not talk too long, which is an occupational hazard. What is the Twig Research Kitchen? So this is our little description. It's a feminist research space for tinkering with convivial, non-extractive, and nourishing modes of research about toxicity, infrastructure, and waste across the social sciences and humanities. So, you know, there's two kind of things that the lab is about, or that the kitchen is about. One of them is thematic, and the other one is a kind of praxis question. So how do we do what we do in addition to what we do topically? Whoops. We have a range of projects. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but right now we have 4 projects that are living under the umbrella of the kitchen. And all of them, to a certain extent, are group projects. The Toronto to Toronto Chem Map project is a project that I didn't initiate. It's a project of Sophia Jaworski, who's a graduate student whose defense date was just set for not too long from now in the Department of Anthropology. But the other projects are projects that I was part of originating, or in some ways are kind of like my project, but they're also collaborative projects. And the kitchen helps me keep them that way. Like, what are we actually? If I was going to kind of try to do a diagram of what the kitchen is, there's the director, which is me. There's a kind of floating array of graduate and undergraduate student research assistants. And then we have visitors who are kind of people who participate in some of the things that we do, but aren't like affiliated with the lab. We have friends of the kitchen who are people who sort of I talk to and we can lean on for advice and to think with. And then we have a website, because I feel like without a website, none of these spaces exist. And once you have a website, you do exist. So I feel like that's quite central. So thematically, this is an umbrella for thinking about toxicity, infrastructure, and waste in a variety of critical ways. But equally important is that this is a feminist space. And so part of what that means is this kind of like three principles that we try to manifest of convivial, non-extractive, and nourishing research. And so part of the way that we have come together and the way that I'm trying to do things is in opposition to the experience that lots of us have, which is, as Bharat was saying before, the emphasis on outputs, and also the fact that when we gather for academic work or when we're engaged in our scholarship and research, often we feel exhausted. And so one of the questions is, can we do our work, whatever that is, without depleting ourselves? And can we feel like our bucket is more full at the end of an engagement than it is empty? So how do we do this? And to me, hospitality is the frame that I have for thinking about that. And there's a number of reasons for that. And so one of them is a really explicitly feminist reason. So thinking about the kinds of care labor that lots of feminists and Marxist feminists in particular have helped us think about. So the kitchen, this is part of why I call it a kitchen instead of a lab, is in specific kind of distinction from the lab. The lab, as we know, is really legible to our institutional spaces. And so there's a lot of good reasons to call our spaces labs. But I'm trying to make a claim to say what happens, maybe we can create legibility that doesn't have to rely on the models of empiricism that gave us the lab, which are masculinist and colonial in their histories. And so another place that hospitality, one of the reasons that hospitality is a kind of guide for me and for us, is that it's an anti-colonial imperative. So as a white settler, in a white settler state, part of what I think about, particularly in this area of the world, which is governed by the dish with one spoon wampum belt covenant between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people, which is a covenant that has much to do with hospitality, is to think about what it means to be a good guest if you're an uninvited guest. And so that's a very specifically located way of thinking about hospitality, and is kind of aligned with our values and what we try to put into practice when we're doing what we do. And then the last one is a provocation of disability justice. The framework of disability justice informs a lot of what I do, and hospitality is relevant there because two of the principles of disability justice are wholeness. So the idea that you bring your whole complex self to whatever you're engaging in, and that needs to be met, right? Collectively, we have to find a way to meet each other's needs and capacities. And also that our organizing and our politics and our movement making and our research, I would extend, has to be sustainable. So to kind of race through a few points about what this looks like. So this is an image of a group of undergraduate students sitting on a platform that's actually a piece of art that was curated by the Blackwood Gallery here at UTM last spring. And I'm sitting there. This was taken by Sophia Jaworski, and these are student research assistants who are working with us on the Toronto Chem Map. And we're doing a kind of exercise to identify the desires that people have for how they're going to spend their time as we're working on this project together. And we're sort of lining up using index cards people's desires with the tasks that we need to do, right? So this is like part of the way that we work, or one way of manifesting this. Often when we were doing this kind of work through this month-long intensive that we did, we were outside, sometimes we were in this space, often we were eating and feeding each other and finding ways to nourish each other kind of in all the ways. I'm gonna skip that because I don't have time to talk about that. We also have a lot of different kinds of outputs because these are important in a variety of ways. So, we have publications, we have things that might fall under the heading of research creation, more kind of creative outputs. We have tools that are public facing, that are not just for scholars or students, but for the general public. We also have a little bit of swag. I forgot to bring postcards. I was going to bring those for everybody. And also sweet nothings, right? So coming back to Bharat's point about sometimes to slow down or to not have an imperative to create something in the end, to think, how can we be generative for people, which doesn't necessarily mean being generative of things. And then just the last point, this kind of principle of sustainability. This is the postcard that I was going to bring for everybody that we made, which is just a lonely egg on a beach. And it says underneath, hang in there. So one of the things about the lab is that it's been kind of fallow this year. And the reason for that is because after many, many years of going like full steam, full bore myself, having a million projects on the go, and then also having like a range of different caregiving responsibilities, which were obviously exacerbated in different ways through COVID, I kind of hit a wall and was like, I can't actually maintain my research right now. So one of the things that was really nice was I felt like I could kind of take a pause. But also that because these projects are collective, because they work on these different kinds of timelines, because they don't necessarily have an output as the validator of their worth, that the projects can continue to exist in the hands of other people. And then also, there's a robust enough kind of network of people and their energies that things can sort of float for a little while. So as I've been fallow in the last couple of semesters, the kitchen still exists. It helps that it has a website. But I think that this is also something really important. And I was reminded of it when I was having a conversation recently in California, in Mill Valley, on the way to this beach with a colleague actually of Bharat's at UCLA, Nick Shapiro, who was like, yeah, all of the labs that I think of as being really great spaces and having been there forever and constantly going, and producing all kinds of stuff, that they have all had these periods of pause and rest. And so thinking about the cycles that we might go through, as Jessica was also saying, COVID induces us to reflect on these cycles. I think that's one of the possibilities and kind of imperatives that we try to think about. I think it should. I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you. I'm so glad that a lot of the topics I want to touch on has been reflected by a lot of your presentations as well. Can everyone see the screen? Oh, I can't even see the response. So,
Yes.
so I want to talk about our equality lab at William and Mary in Virginia. And I really want to credit our director, Elizabeth Losh, who was also my dissertation advisor, for a lot of the content that is generated from my reflection on working with her and my colleagues within the lab. So very much, I'm telling this from a very student perspective because I was a graduate student when our lab was founded back in 2015. I was a graduate assistant right as COVID was hitting, so that halted a lot of the projects we were doing. So sharing that perspective of someone who provided labor as a student in creating this lab space. And it was a space that was very much born out of a need for showcasing student work. We needed a place to do our own research, and digital technology was just one methodology that was much needed on our scholarship on campus that was missing at the time. So I want to draw you to the mission statement of the lab. We provide an environment to foster collaborative and interdisciplinary research by using digital tools to answer fundamental questions about the nature of equality across different domains. And I want to emphasize a lot of the research that we actually do is about inequality, but no one's going to fund an inequality lab. So we chose the name Equality Lab very specifically because it is a problematic term. We understand the difference between equality versus equity and some of the issues that arises from the DEI industrial complexes. So very much is the conscious choice to go with this name. One of the issue though was none of the signage we could get at the beginning was ever correct. The room number was wrong, or they kept referring to us as the Equality Center, which again, in institutional branding, a center just sounds so much fancier than a lab space. And it denotes some sort of prestige or higher funding that we would get from what we actually were getting. And speaking about institutional branding, this is the logo that was created. And if you can see, it's a visual representation of the Wren building, which is the oldest building on campus. And so what we wanted to portray ourselves as is being in this really imagined 18th century space that was, again, not the reality. In reality, this was the space we got. No windows, small room within a building that was sinking into the ground. And sometimes we would have to co-op existing adjoining classrooms to make space for our work and our lecture series and all of that. But what we really got out of was, and I think we sort of set ourselves as this rebel on campus where we really wanted it to undermine the visual optics of what a DH lab could and should be by inhabiting these spaces. And if you see some of the pictures, like we're hosting classrooms, courses, but we are also hosting game night and celebrating Valentine's Day. So the real purpose of the lab as a situated space really became a space that could be appropriated for whatever use the user wanted it to be. And again, upending that idea of what a lab can and should be. And of course, that letting people appropriate the space and the work and the tools within that space leaves a lot of room for mess and failure. And I think all of our projects speaks to that on some scale. And because I've never been able to live this incident down, so I'm just going to take this opportunity to reclaim that narrative for myself. So this picture here was taken in 2016. It was a part of a project for a colleague, Lindsay Garcia. She was exploring abandoned places around William and Mary campus and the non-human residents that inhabit these spaces. And so we're here at Diller Complex, and again, abandoned dormitory section that we're not allowed to enter. And so from the Equality Lab, we got a brand new drone. And so we were flying the drone for the first time that day, trying to capture some of the activities of these non-human agents into these spaces we could not enter. And then just a few minutes after this photo was taken, I actually flew the drone into a tree, a several $1,000 drone into a tree, and then proceeded to climb up the tree, giving Liz a heart attack in the process. And we spent like 2 hours trying to figure out how to get this drone back down. And what we came up with was just, I think it involved a football, a blanket, and a tree branch. So we just jerry-rigged this contraption to try to get it down. And it was a complete failure. The drone was broken. But what came out of it in that moment, as I reflect on it, is this beautiful moment of experimentation. And I think that's what the Equality Lab for us as students, as fellows within that, using that space really appreciated. And so I really want to end just highlighting some of the research that the fellows have done within this space over the years. And granted, this is not encompassing at all of the works there, but you can see the diversity within that work. And one of the reasons I really want to highlight, because the whole mission of our lab was to showcase student work and showcase the labor that went into making this space. And I would love to talk more about the actual physical labor that went into creating this space. But it was so important that how we're using that lab space as a tool to hack and tinker and to test our own academic identity. One of the things I really appreciated from Liz Lodge as our director was her insistence in not using terms like students or mentor mentees. She was really insistent on calling us fellows, members, early career professionals, because it really demonstrates that a lot of the projects that came out of this space is not static. It wasn't frozen in amber. It is continuing. We're bringing our pedagogy, we're bringing our digital inquiries into new spaces as we move out of this equality lab and then building our own lab spaces. So I'll end it there for now. There's a lot of things I could talk about, especially this cockroach disco that somebody built. I'd love to talk about that. But yeah, I want to save a lot of times too for discussion because Bharath has to leave at 1 o'clock. So I want to make sure that we have enough time for everyone to join the discussion.
Okay, I'm back. So as Khan mentioned, Bharath needs to take off at 1. So if anyone has, obviously anyone can ask any question they want, but if you have a question, a burning question about heat and the heat lab, please get it while the getting's good. So I think I have Tia watching the Zoom chat. So let me know if there's any hand raising because I don't want to have my back here. But maybe I'll start with more of a comment than a question. One of the things that a common theme that I was really drawn to in all 4 of the presentations was kind of the important relationship between metaphor and identity, and that like I really love the kitchen versus the lab, but at the same time, the language and imaginary of the lab as something that people with money will recognize almost immediately. And so I think it's interesting to think through the amount of work that you have to do to make the kitchen legible as a space that is similar but very different to labs. And so I'd be interested to hear, Zoe, about some of the maybe challenges or interesting conversations that you had around the selection of that particular metaphor. And then in terms of the kind of like identity question of members, I think that it's interesting that in each of these very different spaces that each of you have played a part in building, that the insistence on space for risk and space for experimentation, which to me is something like learning is risky behavior, and that should be what we emphasize with students, but a lot of the time it's not. And so I would be curious if any of you want to share some reflections on this kind of other sort of space of identity for your lab members, or maybe for yourself as directors, that becomes possible, that's sort of separate from the roles that you play in the classroom or I guess I just wonder, is it different than, how is being the director or member of a lab different than being a member of a research project, like a standalone research project? Like, what about the sort of bigger kind of container of the lab or the kitchen or this kind of space? So that's a rambly opening. I'm just gesturing to Zoe and Khan because they're right next to me, but Bharat and Jessica, please feel free to hop in if you have any comments.
Well, in response to your last point about how, like, what other identity configurations are possible with a container of this type of group versus a project with its own timeline and goal, one of the things that is apparent in our group is the ability to be vulnerable. We do a lot of talking about our struggles with working. We have a whole well-developed set of lingo for for things that we are struggling to accomplish. And there's a lot of discussion about where each member of the lab, no matter what their like place in the institutional hierarchy is allowed to be a human being and to show multiple sides of themselves in their work. And yeah, that vulnerability for me is different from any other professional space I've experienced. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there.
Can I just add to that quickly? So one of the best pieces of advice I got about collaborative research was from a colleague, Hannah Landecker, who said that good collaborative research emerges out of friendship, right? And I sat with that for a long time, and I realized, if you want to hang out with somebody, you're more likely to spend time with them and develop ideas and new insights and figure out what to do. And that's something I think that's been central to my lab. I mean, I have a lab manager who helps kind of organize all kinds of social events, and the students spend a great deal of time together outside of our regular meetings because they are in fact friends. And I think so much emerges. I mean, we're doing a podcast now, and they love just spending time in the podcast room, and so they just book it for hours and hours each week just to hang out. And I think those kinds of developing friendship as a kind of foundation for research, I think it really makes things thrive, because it's a culture not of did you do this, did you do that, and trying to kind of enforce accountability. And it's one where there's a sense of accountability that develops in relationship to your friends who you don't want to let down, but who also will understand if you can't come through with a commitment in a given moment, and who will understand when you say, I'm really tired, I'm very busy, I'm not feeling well, there's a lot going on, right? So there's both a space for kind of forgiveness or kind of grace, and there's also a space for kind of working for others because you are committed to them in some deeper way than just a kind of collegial or formal relationship.
I love that idea. And I mean, I sometimes there's this, often we like, as professors, we often have this conversation about like, what do we have control over? Do we have control over our money, or do we have control over our time? And surprisingly, we often have more control over our money than we have over our time. It's easier to get money than it is to get time. And so thinking about how we spend, I mean, this I think is very sympathetic with what we're trying to do at the kitchen. Like we want to spend time in ways that we enjoy, right? Or with people who we enjoy spending time with. I think this question of like the difference between being part of a research project or being part of something bigger is really interesting. I mean, the research kitchen is really new. And so we're working these things out, including trying to figure out like what feels like a equitable structure to bring people in. My stance thus far has been that everybody who participates gets paid. And that's been sustainable so far, but I don't know how long it will be sustainable. It depends on funding and things like that. And we often think about relationships as being like either transactional, meaning they're couched within money, or some kind of equitable exchange, or they're like friendships that grow through the kinds of obligations and sets of responsibility that Bharat was just talking about. And I have found myself increasingly becoming suspicious of that distinction, in part through lessons that I've learned from friends and research participants in disability communities who are like confronted all the time with this ideal that you can have a care collective full of friends who are there to meet your needs, but also have told me that having transactional relationships where the boundaries are extremely clear can be super important and necessary. And so, I'm thinking about all of those things. I think one of the other things that kind of like goes beyond the working on a project is this, as we were just hearing, this kind of the vulnerability piece, but also the possibilities of experimentation. And I think there is this sense of, like you were talking about this too, the sense of being part of something else, right? Particularly if the lab or studio or whatever it is sort of unconventional. then you're part of generating new infrastructures for doing different kinds of work and finding different ways of being with each other within a scholarly frame. And so I think that like when we've had our routine was to have like bi-weekly meetings and to be co-working in those meetings and figuring out paths forward. I think that sense of being part of something bigger is like quite exciting and I would like to think satisfying for people. Yeah.
And actually to add on to that, because the work that we did in the equality lab was very individual. It was each of us had our own individual project because our interest and research was so diverse. But it was those, like with the drone incident, we learned the skills in DH, we learned the collaborative nature of DH in these really low stakes, high humor situations. And I think that creates the best form of DH scholarship, where again, Barath was, and I think everyone's talking about, sometimes it doesn't have to be generative. We don't have to have a deliverable at the end of the day. And so creating a space like that for students, at least, I think it was a freeing experience from deadlines, from project due dates, and all of that, so that we could just be friends, so that we can enjoy that moment of messing up, of failing together. I think it's just a beautiful moment.
I think Barath has to run.
Okay. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hope we have a chance to continue this conversation in some form. I'm sorry to run. I have a student with qualifying exams, but can't wait for more. Thank you.
Thank you, and best of luck to your student.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions in the chat, or does anyone in our Zoom group have a question? Or also if nope, just thumbs up. Okay, there's also opportunity if there's questions that the panelists would like to ask each other, please do.
Well, I wanted to ask, since I think we all mentioned it, one of the questions that really struck with me, and I never really stopped to ask myself this too, the Equality Lab fellows, we've all identified the lab as a feminist lab without really stopping to considering why. And I think I really appreciate you mentioning how you called your space a kitchen instead of a lab, because a lot of times there are moments when I think, if we qualify it as a feminist lab, is that putting more burden onto, especially in DH, when so much of the scholarship is done by women of color, right? Are we adding more burden when we put on that bracket or that moniker of it's a feminist lab? So I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, part of it, like the website has like a Q&A or a FAQ rather. And so some of the questions are like, is this a lab? Why is it called a kitchen? Like, and part of it is my decision to call it a kitchen, and this is why I sort of put non-innocence in brackets, right, is that there's no good solution for these dilemmas. And so my choice in a context where it's now possible for digital humanities labs and also kind of, soft social science labs to exist and be legitimized, I feel like it's a safe enough moment to try to carve out something else, because I think 100%, there are a lot of labs that I can think of that call themselves labs across a range of disciplines that are feminist, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, but that is just not kind of in the name or in the first line of the description or whatever, right? So part of what I'm trying to do is to make it really explicit. I mean, it's the same reason why, like, sometimes when I'm teaching, I talk about white supremacy instead of talking about racism, because we are very comfortable often doing things that are feminist, and sometimes we're not so comfortable naming that they're feminist. and then asking questions to say that it's feminist. What does that mean, right? There's so many iterations of feminism. We need to have conversations about, you know, the whiteness of many forms of feminism and what that means. Just like we're now yet generally pretty comfortable talking about anti-racism, but we're less comfortable naming something as white supremacy. So, so part of it is like, I have found over the years that my role is as a scholar in service work and other kinds of administrative positions is to say the quiet part out loud. Like that's my job in the room often. So part of it is that. And I think I also have a little list on the website of other spaces that are not, that don't call themselves labs, right? Particularly studios. And I think it's worth thinking about what, you know, do we have to make, if we want to call it a lab, amen, go ahead and do it and show us all the things a lab can be, right? But do these spaces have to be totally captured by this particular imaginary? And what do we foreground and what do we background by calling something a studio versus a lab, or a kitchen versus a lab, or a collaborative, or forgetting other names of these things, but you know, there's a lot of options, right? So yeah, it's also
A gang,
right? To be maximally thoughtful, right? Is, you know, part of the.
I have lots of questions, so I'll just keep going, but feel free. Julia.
Okay. 2 questions. Oh, sorry, Matt, did you?
No, Julia, you got called. You get to go.
This is really half formed, but like number 1, I want to hear about the cockroaches. But number 2, I'm interested in, and I understand that this might be ineffable and hard to sort of pinpoint, and that's kind of the point, is to piece apart these sort of like, I don't know, politics of metrics and perceptibility in scholarship, but like, I'm interested in like how, particularly Zoe, like in terms of like hospitality, right? As sort of this politics of anti-colonial and feminist, like politics of care in a way, of doing research. Like, how does that actually shape like your research, the knowledge that you learn as a collaborative? Like, are there moments throughout the process where you're like, I wouldn't have known this if we didn't have this kind of, this kitchen, this way of producing knowledge? Like, how does the way of producing knowledge impact what you come to know together as a group? Or has that been part of the process for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you want to talk about the cockroaches first?
No, I could go on for hours about.
I don't really want to hear about the cockroaches, actually. I haven't thought of it. So yeah, I think that's such a great question. And hope, you know, I think that we know from whatever critical perspectives we're kind of coming at research and research practice, we know that the way we do things shapes the things we know, shapes the things we learn, right? And I would say, I'm trying to think of like some examples. So one of them is, you know, I have this project that's about US military burn pits, where these like giant garbage fires where the US military disposed of all of the waste that it produced in Iraq and Afghanistan arguably until 2011, but still ongoing after that. Super toxic in a million ways. And working in this kind of in this way that partly was about, you know, how to make this nourishing for people. So having last year at a certain point, there were 2 research assistants who were the kind of core parts of the lab, Sophia Jaworski and Bradley Dunsythe, who are both PhD students in anthropology. And part of what we would do is say, like, where is your curiosity right now? Like, what is it that you want to be thinking about across all of these projects, or maybe bringing something else in that is yours? And Bradley was really interested. Bradley's work is on waste. And so he was quite interested in the burn pit project. And I had this interest in plastic water bottles, which were all of the plastic water bottles that the US military was drinking only bottled water, and all of the bottles of water got burnt, right? So, you know, and there's some quantification of how many bottles of water this was in the first few months of the war, but not after that. And I had a lot of questions because part of the Burn Pit project is also about infrastructure and the movement of commodities. Where did these water bottles come from? And because of Bradley's interest, this was also something that was interesting to him. And he was like, I'm gonna poke around and see what I can find. And so he basically created the germ of what is like a spin-off project of the Burn Pit project, which is about the infrastructure of potable water for US military service members in Iraq. I learned a huge amount. And I went back to some of my fieldwork interlocutors and said, like, do y'all know anything about, like, it turns out that the US military created 6 different water bottling plants in Iraq around 2005, 2006. Do you know anything about this? And one of my fieldwork interlocutors was like, I took a tour of the lab, of the bottling plant that they built. And I can tell you, I remember everything about it. And I can tell you all about it. And I have friends who know about it. And so now this is kind of, it's a thing that came out because of Bradley's curiosity. It's something that I'm planning a series of interviews with my fieldwork interlocutors about. And it's something that, you know, it was interesting to me. I didn't have the capacity to chase it down on my own. And the way that Bradley kind of explored it, you know, is a very, very concrete thing. And, you know, are we going to publish something about it? I don't know. Maybe we'll write together about it, maybe not. But as an example of kind of, and that's also a good example of how it's different than working on a project, right? Because the water bottle thing was interesting to me, but it wasn't part of the project. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to tie that Julia's question with, I want to hear from Jessica, because I was fascinated when you talked about that morphing or evolving meaning or purpose of the lab, as especially I think COVID, for me at least, COVID ended everything, all of our work right there. And then when this university shut down I think in March. And so everything that we had planned was just completely ended. And I think we're still continuing a lot of work now as it's picking up. But again, I haven't been in touch with some of those people. I don't know how that meaning has evolved, especially when we're talking about bringing it back to Julia's question about forming projects and doing this collaborative work together.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it hadn't occurred to me before this conversation that my particular group might be a little unusual in being mostly based online. So we had our Friday meetings, but from 2016 on, we were a virtual community the rest of the time. And like the labor, like the people who were being paid full time might do most of their work in sort of a vague resemblance of business working hours, but we would often be online the rest of the time because we were friends. And when the pandemic hit, our director had a family member die quite early of COVID, and the rest of us, I remember a very vivid moment of being isolated in my house and using my niece's markers to draw a picture of a flower that I then sent in along with about 20 or 30 other lab members to create a virtual bouquet that we shared. And that like reminded me of your cockroaches as well, actually, in the sense of the things that are coming out of the lab being created together that supposedly have nothing to do with our quote unquote research, but that are so important to who we are and how we survive the isolation of academia. And for our group, it was interesting because since we had been so virtual already, initially it seemed as though the pandemic isolation was very easy for us. We were already based online. There wasn't really much of a transition there. We saw each other more than ever. But now as things have continued to evolve and that time length has lengthened, it is harder for us to have the I don't know, the nature of our connections is different, and there's more possibility for misunderstanding or it's for instance, as the lab has grown, people that I will know well because we've been talking to them as collaborators. There was an instance where we introduced someone to the lab without adequately introducing them to the grad students who were the core of the group. And they were like, what, who is this person? Like, should we be frightened? Like, what's the, the politics of how to add new members has been an interesting thing that we're still working through. So yeah, I'm really curious about you folks, how much of an online presence you have, or what your methods are for communicating when you're not seeing each other in person.
For the Equality Lab, we just don't. So a lot of the labor that was put in by not only Liz, but by the graduate assistant was setting up a lot of the infrastructure, like things that you would, people would forget, that goes into setting up the listserv, creating a web page, event page, keeping it updated. All of that essentially stopped. And last I checked, the site hasn't been all that updated except for a listing of events. Like I created a base map for an Omeka site to showcase more student work. That was all going to be digital. It never happened. So I think it curtailed a lot of it, because what we were doing, one of those issue I think with a lot of physical lab space too, is getting people to come in and use the space. We were struggling with that. You could see how beautiful our lab was, right, in that sinking building. So trying all these methods to get people to come in, and once they finally were, you have the pandemic. And they were forced, and we didn't have that infrastructure, digital infrastructure set in place. We were focused on the physical space, because a lot of the projects we were encouraging was these kinds of rapid prototyping. Because for digital and computational methods to come to William and Mary, Liz Lodge brought that. There was no communication between the sciences and the humanities at that time in terms of computing and digital work. And so how do you teach a bunch of humanists or people in the arts and humanities to do computation? You start with prototyping, you start with analog and digital tools. And a lot of that had to be really done in person. And that's how we created that community, by being together in one space. And then, of course, that never materialized. So that was one of the biggest regrets I have of not, well, I can't blame myself for not predicting the pandemic. Well, if you look at the projects, some of them were talking about like school monitoring surveillance. A lot of them was all about like preparation. One was like a feminist post-apocalypse commune project. So we saw it coming, sort of. But yeah, not having that infrastructure in place so that we can migrate from the physical to the digital.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, Jessica, the Slack situation is really core to what you guys were doing and how you manifest yourselves in this space. I mean, I think, we started during the pandemic, and so we're having Zoom meetings, and that's basically how we're connecting with each other. And then in the spring, we got to do this month-long project that was funded by the Dackman Humanities Institute, and we use this space that we're in now, Cedars. And late this year, or maybe next year, we'll have a physical space on campus that's going to be a shared lab with another a colleague of mine in anthropology here. And I have kind of like ambivalent feelings about the physical space, because the nature of at my previous position at Rice University, when I was starting to do some of this work, it was really frustrating to not have a space, mostly because we wanted to be gathering. We also had some equipment for, like tripods and video cameras and things like that for doing interviews that we wanted to house places. And we wanted to have a place where we could gather and, like eat vegan tamales, right? Like, as you do. And it's at the same time, I'm aware of the kind of like colonial land grabby nature of wanting to occupy space on campus. And knowing that chances are I'm not actually going to use the physical space that I'll have here that much. So I'm very happy that it's going to end up being a shared space. And we're trying to kind of build flexibility into that physical space. But mostly like the digital life of the lab is the website and then our Dropbox and Google Drive folders where we are sharing documents or co-working on documents or where our little archives of research live. And I think eventually we'll probably move to something like Slack as we get like a more consistent core of people. Yeah, I mean, do you know how Slack ended up being the thing?
I think,
Read a whole article on
Oh,
it.
did you? Okay.
yeah, we wrote, we have an article called One Love Heart at a Time, like effective community building in a medieval studies lab. And so for us, we adopted Slack. I think they just needed a platform where people could communicate in a sort of centralized way. And instantly there was an element of creativity on it that was really addictive. Like we have, it was such a playful space, whether that was the way that you would decorate someone's response with a falling leaf emoji or like the sorts of things that we would create for one another made it so much better than, for instance, my experience of Teams as an administrative U of T space has been. There, like the people were writing poetry from the beginning, and just there was a sense that the creative and quirky sides of our work could blend seamlessly with our scholarship. But the so once we started that, we had a sort of instant adoption, which I think was partly a result of the particular community that we had. Like I know that they tried to institute Slack in the English and drama faculty briefly at UTM, and then it was it was a lead balloon. No one wanted to be on it, and it was sort of, I think, too much of a, yeah, I don't know. It was interesting. The other community that I know of that's really adopted Slack and it's been good for them is the Practices of Commentary Research Group, who I think also have a pretty active community there. Yeah, it's been interesting. Yeah, I forgot where I was going on that one. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I guess another question that I had that I think we've kind of answered, but I'm very curious about what people think about, like, what is the, this is in advance for our prototyping conversation next month, but what do you think is like the minimum viable formation that makes something, like, what do you need for something to be like a lab or a kitchen or one of these things? Like what kinds of things are sort of the threshold between, yes, now we have this other thing and it's not just me and my student or me and my friends. Like, is it a name? Is it a website?
For us, it was
Yeah.
Rage.
Right.
I mean, Liz probably has her own origin story for the Equality Lab. It was in the works way before, but for us students, I think, I'll speak for all of them. I think it started from it started. Well, one of them might be on there, but it started from this moment. We were sitting on a guest lecturer who was doing. They will not be named. Their project will not be named, but they were doing research in a country in West Africa. And along that presentation, I think at some point we just started getting up and walking out because what they were doing, we just could not agree with. It felt exploitative. It felt really, it was colonial. It completely colonial. And I'm still upset thinking about it. And so I think we all gathered outside in the courtyard and we just raged. It was like, we can't, is this what DH is? Is this the scholarship? Like we refusing to do that. And I think from there, it somehow, I think we all blacked out and suddenly Liz comes to us and saying, oh, we're forming this Equality Lab then. And then, you know, and the nice thing was she didn't set up these barriers for who could be members. If you wanted to, you're an automatic fellow. Doesn't matter what kind of background you came in with. So I think that made it easier for us to then form a group and saying like, okay, now we're just Equality Lab Fellows and we have this very specific need to do this kind of scholarship our way. That's sort of how I would conceptualize the origin of that. So not anything tangible, but sort of that affect of that
A kind of
need,
shared question and shared desire.
Yeah, needing a certain practice to be in place for our own work.
Jessica, do you have thoughts?
I'm thinking about whether it's to do with the interconnection of relationships between different people in that community. Because a supervisor could meet with a group of supervisees, I've seen it, but those are all single relationships. So for us, between those two scholars, but once there's a unification of a network of people who are united by whether it's rage or whether it's by sharing new kitchen supplies to somebody who's recently moved to Toronto or whatever, those connections I think what turns a more disparate research community into an actual community that is going to move forward together. Yeah, what do you think, Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was the website. I was like, I'm doing this thing. And then once the website existed, I felt like I could say, here it is, like there was something to point to. But certainly in the process of doing that, it also meant, part of it was like, I had been doing this work before the kitchen existed, and I had realized that I needed a container for this. And so I kind of built the container after the work had already started. And it felt really satisfying. Part of the significance of the website for me was also then for funding applications and things like that, to say, here it is, here are the people who are affiliated with it. And to have something that made it seem like it's not just me and my students, right? Like sitting around twiddling our thumbs. So I think that that's part of it. And then the other thing is that now that it exists in this way and the projects have funding from different sources, it accrues. So there's sort of like a little bit of a snowball effect of making it like a real thing and being able to say there's a there. And whenever something happens that we can bring under the umbrella of the kitchen, that makes it more robust, and so so
I like it.
Yeah.
Right. Do we have any questions in the chat, or anyone else want to chime in?
I have a really quick question.
Yeah, go for it, Matt.
It's just like a personal interest thing, but Con, in one of your slides, there was a project about like using piezoelectric sensors to play a melody through plates.
Yeah.
I want to know, where can I get more information on like that project? Because I love playing with Arduinos and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it was actually one of the earlier ones that was in collaboration with the physics department, because before we set up the Equality Lab, the only sort of makerspace on campus was in the physics department. And so they would host a summer boot camp for if you wanted to learn how to use their makerspace, if you wanted to learn something in technology. I learned how to 3D model from those workshops. And so that was one of the projects that grew out of that. I think teaching us how to use Arduino, and they made it sound easy, but music, I think, was the gateway to playing with our Arduino, was how they structured that workshop for us. I don't know how to get you in touch with, because I think his picture is, I pictured him with a project on the side there. I haven't been in contact with him, but absolutely, if you want to explore Arduino with me and creating music sometime, absolutely.
My first ever Arduino project was music based, so I'm always happy to explore that with you. But yeah, thank you for that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think if there's last call, I'll give a last call opportunity. All right, I'd like to invite all of you to please join me in thanking our 4 speakers today, Broth, who is now in an exam, Jessica, Zoe, and Con. Thank you so much for making the time to join us in this hybrid event. CDHI has, I noticed Julia did this when she was facilitating. So a takeaway that I have, I thought it was cool, so I'm going to do it too. So I think if you want to start a lab, you should do it. What you need is a name, a cool name, a website, some sort of shared project, and I think a strong emotion. But also one thing that I wanted to get into more that maybe we will another day in terms of thinking about collaboration more generally is friendship as method for collaboration, and thinking about the kinds of communication and shared understanding that can infuse research when it starts with like the thickness of friendship opposed to these other kinds of often contractual relationships. But that's a big topic. So to conclude for today, I just want to put some CDHI upcoming events on your mental and emotional calendars. So first, we have our 6th and final lightning lunch of this academic year, which is scheduled for Wednesday, April 12th. It will be on the theme of prototyping DH, and the speakers will be examining the need for an essential role of prototyping in DH research and scholarship. That will be back to our usual virtual format. And I believe someone is putting the link to that in the chat. So thank you, link copier. Then we also have our 3rd and final visiting scholar event of the year on March 29th. Dr. Ali Martin, who is an assistant professor at Dartmouth College in the music department and in the cluster for digital humanities and social engagement, is going to join us for an amazing presentation on Black Sonic life. That is also in the chat. And that event is generously co-sponsored by the Black Research Network and the Faculty of Music. So it's going to be really good. Dr. Martin's doing really exciting things, so please join us. And as always, please check out our digital drop-ins with the one and only Matt Lefebvre. And that happens every other Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. All of the information is on the old dhn.utoronto.ca. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again in April.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Yes.
Incredibly interesting.
My pleasure.
Good work,
Yep.
people. Good luck.
Read all the comments.
I know,
people
it's
posted.
so
We missed so much.
Weird.
But was the pizza good? I need to know.
Good?
I wanted to get up and eat
Okay.
pizza, but
Eat some pizza, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll stop recording while people have pizza.
I'm gonna move from this